Before the first colonial flag was planted, the land that would later be called the United States was already a vast, living map, home to hundreds of native nations. From the Iroquois in the northeast to the Lakota on the plains and the Pueblo peoples in the southwest, each nation had its own territories, boundaries, and trade routes, shaped not by ink on paper but by tradition, rivers, migration paths, and sacred geography. There were no state borders, no straight-line boundaries slicing through mountains or deserts. Instead, the landscape held meaning the way a language holds stories. A valley belonged to a tribe because generations had hunted there. A river was shared because two nations had agreed to peace centuries ago. This was the original map, complex, ancient, and alive. But across the ocean, a very different type of mapping and ownership was taking shape. Europeans saw land as something to claim, draw lines over, and rule. When the first ships arrived, they carried not only settlers but also surveyors, cartographers, and charters that declared ownership over lands they had never seen. In this moment, two worlds met, one defined by relationships to land, and another defined by borders on paper. And the struggle to redraw the land in the image of colonizers had just begun. As colonies expanded westward, maps became tools, not just for navigation but for domination. Surveyors marched with soldiers, measuring acre by acre, turning living homelands into numbered parcels. The Land Ordinance of 1785 introduced the rectangular survey system, neat squares, rigid lines, grids imposed over rivers, forests, and tribal boundaries that never followed such shapes. To map the land was to control it. A line on a chart could erase the claim of an entire nation. Treaties were drawn, signed, and often broken, replaced again with new borders drafted in distant offices. The Louisiana Purchase, the Trail of Tears, and Manifest Destiny were not just policies, they were actions carried out through maps that justified expansion in the name of order and progress. Every map redrawn meant a people displaced. As the United States grew on paper, Native Americans were pushed further from their ancestral lands. Reservations were created, not where tribes had lived, but where maps designated they should live. By the mid-1800s, the United States had mastered the art of colonizing through cartography. The map shaped reality, and the nation grew line by line, square by square. By the early 20th century, the map of the lower 48 inches was complete, every border surveyed, every territory absorbed. Alaska and Hawaii would come later, but the continental map was already set in the familiar shape Americans recognize today. Yet beneath the clean lines, the legacy of colonization remained. Once sacred homelands were now farmlands, towns, and cities. Highways ran across ancient trails. State borders divided regions that had once been unified by language, culture, or tribal alliances. Still, indigenous nations continued to survive and reclaim space. New maps emerged, maps of tribal sovereignty, language revitalization, cultural sites, and legal victories that restored pieces of stolen land. These maps told a different story, not of disappearance, but of endurance. The colonization of the United States had been drawn, redrawn, and completed on official maps, but the deeper story of the land, its original people, their histories, and their resurgence, remained beyond the lines. The modern map of the USA shows borders, but the land beneath those borders still holds the memory of its first caretakers.